HBO's Chernobyl miniseries has traumatized viewers in a way that perhaps no TV series has done in recent years. Part of the horror is that many of these terrible things really happened. But here are a few ways the Chernobyl miniseries fudged the truth to tell its story. Chernobyl's most clear-cut hero is Ulana Khomyuk, a nuclear physicist played by Emily Watson who repeatedly risks life and limb to ensure that the true dangers of nuclear radiation and corruption get uncovered. She's a great character, but as Bustle points out, she never existed. For storytelling reasons, the fictional Khomyuk is weaved through real events, so Valery Legasov has another likable character to bounce science talk off of, rather than a whole crew of nameless scientists. However, Ulana wasn't inserted into the series just to move the plot along. She's also a composite of the many real women who became prominent scientists and doctors in the Soviet Union. The reason for this, Chernobyl creator Craig Mazin argues, is that the Soviet Union was actually far more progressive than the United States in elevating women in STEM fields. All the way back in the early 60s, 40% of all Soviet doctorate degrees in chemistry were awarded to women, a statistic that the United States never reached in the 20th century. Now, that doesn't mean women didn't face an uphill struggle if they wanted to get into powerful political positions or be, listened to, but they were well regarded as scientists, and that's the reality the fictional Ulana is meant to represent. If there's one scene in the miniseries that's impossible to forget, it's the sight of a helicopter flying over the reactor and then dropping in midair, killing everyone aboard. The sheer horror of the moment plays out on the faces of Legasov and Boris Sherbina as the two men are forced to reckon with the fact that all those men died because of an order they gave. Yes, this really happened, and the horrendous event was even captured on film. However, the exact circumstances of the real-life helicopter crash were somewhat different. It didn't happen until October 1986, about 5 months after the explosion, rather than 30 hours, as the show puts it. As with most of Chernobyl's creative liberties, showrunner Craig Mazin has been honest about the alteration, and he explained to Men's Health that he deliberately pushed the helicopter crash earlier into the narrative as a way to visually illustrate the deadliness of an open reactor, so audiences would understand what the Soviet officials were dealing with. An invisible menace like nuclear radiation is generally quite difficult to depict on film, but a collapsing helicopter definitely gets it across. The second episode of Chernobyl ends with a heart-stopping Suicide Squad sequence, where 3 brave young men suit up, get their flashlights, and go into Chernobyl's basement to manually drain the bubbler pool and prevent a steam explosion that could have had a catastrophic impact on Eastern Europe. This nightmarish incident has been the subject of competing accounts for decades, to the point where Craig Mazin told Vox that he actually had to totally rewrite the entire scene rather late in production when he discovered that the layman's version of events, that the men were totally submerged, had to literally scuba dive through the basement, and died 2 weeks later, wasn't accurate. The truth is, no one quite knows what went down in that basement, so the show still had to take some creative liberties. In real life, it's believed that the courageous divers largely made their way through the basement in total darkness by feeling their way along pipes. Even scarier than it was on TV? Sure, but harder to depict on film since the sequence would have been mostly a black screen with water noises. HBO's probably had enough of overly dark episodes of television for 1 year. On a positive note, all 3 heroes reportedly not only survived their ordeal, but 2 of them are still alive today. The miniseries depicts very little of Legasov's life outside the Chernobyl incident, but from what little viewers are shown, it's clear that the scientist lives by himself with no family around and seemingly no close friendships other than a pet cat. The real Legasov, though, was far less of a loner. History says at the time of the explosion, the 49-year-old Legasov was a happily married man with 2 adult children. His daughter Inga still gives interviews today. In addition, he was actually informed of the shocking news about Chernobyl at a scheduled party meeting on the morning of April 26, 1988, rather than the early morning phone call depicted in the series. One of the things the series does accurately show is that Legasov spent most of his life as a devoted party ideologue, just like his father before him. It was the fallout from the incident, followed by the lies, cover-ups, and corruption scandals that finally shook his faith in the Soviet institutions. It's also worth noting that Legasov's background was reportedly in physical chemistry rather than nuclear reactors. Chernobyl does a lot to rewrite many of the silly Cold War-era stereotypes about the Soviet Union, largely by presenting its core characters as heroes fighting against a problematic bureaucracy. However, one overplayed trope that the miniseries does fall into, according to the New York Times, is how everyone is constantly worried about the government putting a bullet into their brains. As the Moscow Times points out, there's at least one scene that's particularly over the top.
Tell me how a nuclear reactor works, or I'll have one of these soldiers throw you out of the helicopter.
And that wasn't the only moment in the chopper where we see a threat of mortal violence.
Get us over that building, or I'll have you shot!
Random threats of execution like this weren't a regular part of Soviet life after the 1930s, so the notion of an apparatchik being so unprofessional in 1986 is as unrealistic as, say, a US president grabbing a rocket launcher.
That's President Sawyer.
He has a rocket launcher.
Well, there's something you don't see every day. Here it goes!
The real horror of the late-era Soviet Union, which the series captures correctly in other scenes, was the far more subtle menace of bureaucratic propaganda, false trials, and Orwellian doublespeak that clouded hostile intentions. This sort of corruption goes under the radar, but it's much scarier, particularly because it's still a huge part of how some governments operate today. Throwing a prized popular scientist from a helicopter for no good reason, though? That's less Boris Sherbina and more Boris Badenov.
Boris, you have great idea.
No, but I have defective cord and electric pencil sharpener.
Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.